A single arrow is easily broken, but not 10 in a bundle. So said Genghis Khan, the horseman of the heavens, the man who conquered more land than any other in recorded history. But what happens when that bundle begins to splinter? Let us begin in the wind-blasted steppe of Central Asia. The year is 1206. A chieftain named, once abandoned, enslaved, and hunted, has united the warring Mongol tribes beneath one banner. No temples, no scrolls, no golden crowns, just blood oaths, bone-deep loyalty, and the promise of eternal conquest. This man, who took the name Genghis Khan, would ride farther, faster, and more ferociously than any ruler before or after. His empire stretched from the frozen forests of Siberia to the misty rivers of Vietnam, from the gates of Baghdad to the trembling edges of Europe. A land empire so vast, it stitched the known world together for a time. But hidden beneath the hoofbeats and legends lies a strange truth. Empires do not fall the way buildings collapse. They fade like echoes in the mountains, slowly, silently, and often the seeds of collapse are planted not by enemies, but by the empire itself. There is a village in northern China where, to this day, the elders refuse to utter the name Gede, not out of hate, but out of fear. Fear of what was unleashed when the second great Khan Genghis' own son drank himself into death and left the throne empty. At the worst possible time, foreign like his father, Gede ruled not by fear and fire, but by bureaucracy. He built roads, issued paper currency, even taxed wine. And perhaps that is the strange curse of peace. It dulls the sword. As trade blossomed and tribute flowed in, the Mongols grew rich, but also stillness for a people born to ride was a slow death. In the shadows of palaces once filled with war councils, rival factions began whispering. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, sons and grandsons of Genghis, once bound by blood, now eyed one another with suspicion. It wasn't war that shattered the Mongol Empire. It was inheritance. Imagine this. A man conquers half the world but forgets to write a will. And so the empire splinters not in one decisive battle, but in court intrigues, in betrayals sealed with ceremonial wine, in borders quietly redrawn behind the scenes. But there is something stranger still. Historians speak of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a time when merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing with a single passport under a single banner. But dig deeper and you find something missing. Despite their unmatched expansion, the Mongols left behind almost no literature. No epic poems, no chronicles of their glory. No great philosophical treatises. Their history, for the most part, was written by their enemies. Why? Some say it was humility, others practicality. But one theory whispers of a deeper cause, deliberate erasure. Because while the Mongols embraced many cultures, Persian art, Chinese administration, Islamic science, they never fully became any of them. They ruled but remained apart, always moving, always watching. And perhaps when the empire began to slip from their fingers, they chose to vanish from memory rather than be remembered in ruin. Even now, archaeologists uncover ruins in the Gobi Desert outposts, palaces, entire cities built by the Mongols then abandoned, swallowed by sand and time. One such ruin, Karakoram, was once the heart of the empire. Yet when Marco Polo visited decades later, it was already half forgotten, a ghost town built by ghosts. And still, the question lingers like dust in the wind. How can something so vast, so powerful, so feared by the world, vanish so quietly? The answer, like the empire itself, is not singular. It is hidden in fragments in plagues that rode the same trade routes as silk and spices. In scholars exiled by khans they once advised. In climate shifts that dried up rivers and triggered famines across the steppe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must return to a night lit only by torchlight when a young Mongol general named Kublai stood atop a mountain in China and looked down upon the Song dynasty. not as a raider, but as an emperor in waiting. It was here, in ambition's final hour, that the empire reached its zenith. And here, perhaps, where it first began to unravel. We've only just begun. High on the mountain, Kublai Khan watched the city below flicker like a mirage, lanterns trembling in the haze of night, temples rising from mist like silent prayers. The Song dynasty was dying. He knew it, and he would be the one to bury it. But unlike his grandfather Genghis, Kublai did not seek destruction. He sought legitimacy. He wore Chinese silk, studied Confucian texts, and ruled not as a steppe warlord but as son of heaven, founder of the Yuan dynasty. In the eyes of the Chinese, however, he was still a foreign barbarian. In the eyes of his Mongol kin, he had become too Chinese, a man caught between worlds, and that tension was the quiet fracture beneath the surface. As Kublai built roads and palaces in Beijing, rebellion brewed in the west. His cousins in Persia refused to recognize him. The Golden Horde, his distant relatives in Russia, mocked his courtly manners and growing belly. The great Mongol Empire was now a tapestry held together by threads of memory. One gust and it would come undone. And yet there was something even more invisible and far more deadly. It began with whispers in the markets of Kaffa, a trading outpost on the Black Sea, bodies swelling with black boils, rats scurrying through grain sacks, sailors dying mid-voyage. The Black Death spread faster than arrows, faster than armies, faster than even the Mongols themselves had traveled. Ironically, it was the roads they built, the safe passageways of the Pax Mongolica, that helped the plague spread across continents like fire-licking dry grass. One empire, one path, one plague. Some chronicles claim it killed over 25 million in Asia alone. The Mongols were not spared. As cities emptied and tribute dried up, the empire's arteries began to clog. Bureaucracies failed. Soldiers mutinied. Even the famed Yam, the empire's lightning-fast postal system, slowed to a crawl. The steppe, once humming with motion, fell into eerie silence. But the death was not just physical. It was also spiritual. You see, the Mongols had no single religion. They allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans to live under one sky. This tolerance had once been a strength, but in times of chaos, it bred confusion. A Muslim vizier in Persia ordered the destruction of Buddhist temples. A Chinese eunuch accused Confucian scholars of plotting against the Khan. Shamans called for blood rituals to appease angry spirits, with no spiritual center to hold the fragments. Together, the soul of the empire began to splinter. One legend tells of a Mongol prince in Central Asia who, seeing his people dying of plague and starvation, climbed a sacred mountain to seek guidance. For 3 days he fasted in silence. On the 4th he returned, and declared that the gods had turned their backs. The next morning he rode alone into the desert. No one ever saw him again. And then came paper, the strange invention that promised to fix everything, and instead revealed just how fragile the empire had become. The Yuan dynasty, facing war and drought, printed currency by the cartload. What had once been a brilliant innovation accepted across 3 continents became a symbol of collapse. Merchants refused. The notes, inflation soared, confidence withered. And still, Kublai Khan held court. Old, tired, and mourning the deaths of his favorite wife and heir, he stared into a mirror of polished obsidian. Some say he whispered, "I have conquered the world," and lost myself. He died in 1294, and with him the illusion of unity. The empire, already fractured in spirit, now fractured in name. Each Khanate pursued its own fate, often at the expense of the others. The Ilkhanate in Persia disintegrated into local warlords and religious strife. The Chagatai Khanate was swallowed by Timur, the lame conqueror who claimed Mongol descent but followed no law but his own. The Golden Horde fragmented into rival clans, eventually succumbing to Muscovite resistance, and the Yuan. Driven back by rebellions, floods, and famine, they were overthrown by the Ming in 1368. The last Mongol emperor fled north, his banners trailing in the snow. What remained was not an empire, but a legend, a memory etched in maps and fears, a name whispered in a dozen tongues, a people once feared by the world, now scattered to the winds, but we're still missing something. Not a battle, not a law or decree, a pattern, because this wasn't just the fall of a people. It was the end of an age. The Mongol Empire had connected the world, tribes and cities, languages and lands in a way that had never been done before. But once those connections were broken, the world seemed to recoil. Walls rose, empires turned. Inward isolation followed expansion. It is almost as if history, like breath, must exhale after it inhales too deeply, and maybe, just maybe, the rise and fall of the Mongols wasn't a unique event, but a cosmic rhythm, a glimpse into something deeper about how power moves, how memory fades, and how even the mightiest are shadows in time. But we have not yet reached the final revelation. There is one more story, one more silence, and in it, the soul of an empire waits. In the Altai Mountains, where clouds scrape the jagged peaks like torn silk, there is said to be a hidden burial ground. No one knows exactly where, no sign marks the spot, no pilgrim dares linger, but legends speak of a deep valley where horses were galloped to death so no living soul would find the graves. The final resting place of Genghis Khan and his bloodline. To this day, satellites and scientists have scoured the terrain, yet the tomb has never been found. And perhaps that is the final act of the Mongol story. Not a monument, but a disappearance. You see, most empires leave behind grand ruins, columns, cathedrals, colosseums. The Mongols, they left silence, as if their very nature was meant to be wind-borne riders of impermanence. But hidden in that silence is a haunting truth. The Mongols didn't fall from defeat. They fell from success. They conquered more than they could carry, adopted systems too foreign to fuse, inherited the world only to find it ungovernable. It is a strange paradox that the greatest land empire in history had no capital for decades, no written language of its own until long after its rise, and no single religion or ideology to bind it, and yet it ruled. But here lies the deeper revelation. The Mongol Empire was never meant to last. It was a storm, swift, violent, transformative, and like all storms, it changed the landscape, then vanished. Take, for example, the story of the Nestorian monks. These were Christian mystics who traveled under Mongol protection across Asia, preaching not to convert, but to observe. They wrote of a strange brotherhood among the Mongols, warriors who killed without mercy in battle, yet wept openly over the death of a horse. Men who burned entire cities and then prayed beside Tibetan lamas, or Persian dervishes. Contradictions? Or a deeper form of unity, one beyond creed or culture? What if the empire's true power was never in its armies or borders, but in its bridges? The Mongols connected worlds that had once believed themselves to be the center of everything. Europe met China, Persia met Russia, maps redrew themselves, myths overlapped, ideas fused. Gunpowder, compass navigation, printing, noodles, even banking systems, they crossed continents during Mongol rule. Some say the Renaissance would have never ignited without this storm clearing the skies. But just as quickly, the bridges crumbled because they were not built from stone but from fear, ambition, and fragile trust. And here is where the pattern repeats. From the Tower of Babel to the Library of Alexandria, from the Mayan cities lost beneath vines to the Roman roads swallowed by dust. There is a rhythm to human history. We reach outward, connect, create. And then we forget. We close the gates, burn the maps, bury the past. And when we look back, all we see is the echo of what was shimmering like a mirage. So what did bring down the Mongol Empire? It was not just plague or rebellion or fractured bloodlines. It was something quieter. The moment when the last rider stopped riding, when the wind paused, when the stories stopped being told around the fire. Some say the empire never ended, it simply dissolved into the people it once ruled. In Kazakh legends, the great Khans became spirits who ride the thunderclouds. In Japan, samurai still speak of the kamikaze, the divine wind that saved them from Mongol fleets. In parts of Central Asia, old families trace their lineage not to kings or priests, but to horsemen. They remember, and maybe that's all empires truly are. Memories wearing the mask of power, but one final image remains. In 2004, a team of archaeologists uncovered a strange anomaly in the Mongolian steppe, what they believed to be an imperial burial site. But when they excavated, they found nothing. No bones, no treasure, just a ring of scorched earth, as if someone had erased history on purpose. And maybe they did, because the Mongols knew something we often forget. That the greatest legacy is not in what we leave behind, but in what we choose to vanish into mystery. So as the empire faded, as borders re-emerged, as languages diverged and cities reclaimed their names, the Mongol legacy slipped quietly into the folds of time. But listen closely on a cold desert night, and you might still hear it, a distant gallop, a cry in the wind. A whisper not of conquest, but of connection, broken and waiting to be rebuilt. Because history does not end, it circles, and somewhere in the ruins and silence, the soul of an empire still rides. In the early light, the steppe is quiet. Mist hangs low over the grasslands, and the earth still remembers hoofbeats from long ago. There are no ruins here, no fallen columns or broken statues, just wind and memory. And maybe that's the final mystery, that the largest land empire in human history left behind almost nothing you can touch, but it left behind everything that moves: ideas, fears, borders, dreams, the pulse of connectedness that still echoes across nations who were once unknowingly tied by Mongol thread. Let us return briefly to a story half whispered in part 1, the unmarked tomb of Genghis Khan. Some believe it lies beneath the forest floor near the Onan River. Others say it was buried beneath a riverbed, its waters permanently redirected to hide the grave. There are even those who claim the entire funeral procession was slaughtered to keep the location secret. But why hide it at all? Every great king wants a monument, a legacy carved in stone. Yet here, the greatest of them all chose absence. Perhaps he knew that to be remembered in silence is to be remembered by spirit, not by structure. That to fade from view is sometimes the only way to remain eternal. There's an old Mongol proverb, do not scorn the weak cub. He may become the brutal tiger, but what becomes of the tiger when it has conquered every prey? When the hunt ends, what remains? And here lies a larger reflection, one not just about the Mongols, but about us. Empires rise not only through conquest, but through momentum. Belief, movement, fire, a shared hunger. But they fall when they mistake stillness for stability, when they trade wonder for wealth, purpose for politics, when the ride ends. So what do we inherit from the Mongols? Not just trade routes or ruins or romantic legends, but a lesson, coded in dust, that greatness cannot be kept. It must be carried, like a flame passed hand to hand across the darkness. And maybe, if we listen carefully, we'll hear the same rhythm again, in the fractured internet echoing across continents, in the blurred lines between cultures, in the speed at which ideas now travel not by horse, but by light. We are, in a way, riding the wind again. But the question is, do we remember the last time? Because the Mongol Empire, for all its violence, left behind something no map can hold, the proof that everything can be connected, and the warning that even the strongest threads fray. You may never find Genghis Khan's tomb, but that was never the point. His story, his empire is not buried in the ground. It's in the silence between empires, in the memory of movement, in the knowing glance between strangers who share no language but recognize something ancient in each other, something shared. So as you close this story, as the echoes fade and the wind returns to its whisper, ask yourself, what else lies forgotten not in books, but in the rhythm of the world? What other truths ride the edge of memory, waiting to be seen not with eyes, but with understanding? The Mongols are gone, but the dust still moves, and somewhere in the space between past and present, a hoofbeat still echoes.